All right, guys. My goal is to get through this within about 30 minutes. We'll see if I can make that. We're going to talk about energy, work design, and applied physiology, muscle contraction, and the cardiovascular system. So, as you can see, this lecture is very focused on work physiology. Energy is defined as the capacity to perform work, and work is the application of a force through a distance. So, to lift a box, to push it along the floor, you are converting energy into work and getting something done. There are lots of types of energy that we don't cover in this class necessarily, but this is a pretty good list. In safety and industrial hygiene, we do think about all of these when we're trying to protect people from the types of energy they can contact while they're trying to do their job. In biological systems, we use a specific type of energy. It's actually a chemical energy that is transformed into a mechanical energy. There's a uh, a molecule called adenosine triphosphate, and it has multiple small parts. The triphosphate there tells you that there are three phosphate molecules in uh, molecules within this larger molecule. there are there's chemical energy stored in the bonds between those pieces, and when you remove one, then you release energy. So you can see here you go from ATP, that's the triphosphate, to diphosphate. So there are just two left, and one has released, and that the breaking of that chemical bond gives you energy, and actually it gives you 7 to 12 kilocalories. ATP has to be regenerated through a process called resynthesis. We're not going to get too in depth in this, but if you've ever taken a molecular biology class, then you probably had to learn and memorize that cycle. When there is no oxygen present in the muscles, for example, that is called anaerobic work. And it doesn't require oxygen, but it has some downsides to it. And we'll talk a little bit about those. Basically, though, you do get a buildup of lactic acid, and the the process for resynthesis is not very efficient. So you don't get quite as much bang for your buck when you're doing anaerobic work. You can get your body can harvest more energy out of its what it inputs when you're doing aerobic work, which means that you're using oxygen. We have three systems that we're going to talk about. There are bursts of energy that only last a few minutes or seconds, even prolonged work, where you have anaerobic shifting to aerobic. If you think, for example, a long marathon run, generally that's aerobic. So you have enough oxygen, you're still going to get sore and you'll get some lactic acid, but you're able to spread it out over a long period of time because your muscles continue to get the oxygen and other nutrients that they need, and it's able to clear out. You're able to clear out waste. When you have an oxygen deficit, again, that would be considered anaerobic. And there is such a thing as oxygen debt. So you may be familiar with the term sleep debt. If you're not getting enough sleep, it kind of builds up over time, and it's called sleep debt. Well, the same concept applies to oxygen debt, where if your muscles are unable to get enough oxygen, if they have a deficit for a period of time, then it takes time for your body to get rid of the debt. It's got to pay it back. And so once the work is done, you can see this graph on the bottom. A deficit builds to a certain max there. Once the work is done, then your body is paying off that oxygen debt and getting everything back to a more pleasant state, a balanced state. For dynamic work, the American Industrial Hygiene Association has some work rest schedules that they recommend using. I'm not real familiar with these, even though I I am a member of AIHA and active in the local and national groups. But it's something to consider if you're trying to figure out how quickly you need to pace work, or how slowly, for example, if you need to slow it down. They have this little equation here where the percent of rest time is this fraction here, m divided by 4 minus 1, and then multiplied by 100, so that gives you the percentage. So pretty simple, and you can see an example down below. Romer has an important figure for work rest schedules that we may use later on. You can see here that depending on the type of work that's being done, if you look at the x-axis, you have light, moderate, heavy, very heavy, and extremely heavy. On the y-axis, you have the rest allowance, so anywhere from 0 up to 200%. And then each of these lines represents a duration. So if you're doing light work, you can do that for 60 to 120 minutes without a whole lot of rest allowance. But if you're doing, for example, extremely heavy work over a period of 1 minute, then you can see how it changes there. We when we work, we usually work in an 8-hour day. You can see how much horsepower we're able to produce, about 1/10 of 1 horsepower. 1 horse is 1 horsepower. So it's kind of interesting how 1 horsepower is determined, and then the tractor is at about 70 horsepower. We're, as that says, we're not the best source of mechanical energy. We're just not. Machines much better, and plenty of animals are much better at producing mechanical energy than we are. You can see here at this on this bottom table some of the basic daily energy requirements for different activities. And if you do any, if you do amounts of time, if you do these activities during durations that are similar to the time listed here. So it's saying sleeping for 8 hours, sitting for 6 hours, standing for 6 hours, walking for two, and other for two. Then you would get an estimate of what your um, energy expenditure might be for the day. You can see. I'm assuming this is for an average man and woman. For the average male, it's 29,000. Excuse me, 2,900 calories, and for the average woman, about 2,100 calories. Astron's nomogram is a way of determining different measures of physiology based on other measures of physiology. So it's a visual or graphical representation of the relationship among physiology and basic demographics or characteristics of a person. So you can see we have lines for the length of their step, for the person's weight, for their gender. We on the left, you have the pulse rate. We have VO2 max, and we haven't really talked about that. That is the maximum amount of oxygen that you're able to uptake during your any an intense exercise. So if you ever see commercials, sometimes you see commercials of sports equipment or drinks or something where they have an athlete who is on a treadmill and they have this mask over their face and they're running real fast or something. They are measuring VO2. It may not be the VO2 max. They may be looking at a sub-maximal VO2, but that's what that mask is measuring is VO2, whether it's a max or submax. So here are some submaximal techniques. If you want to estimate your maximal heart rate, you need to take 220 minus your age. If you want to estimate the percent heart rate range, then you need to use this equation down here. So the heart rate while you're doing work minus the heart rate while you're at rest divided by your heart rate max, which is you use that little equation up above, 220 minus your age to find that, minus your heart rate at rest, and then multiplied by 100 to get 100%. And there's a little example of that down below. There's a whole cascade of events that happen when we want to do anything with our muscles, and it happens, in milliseconds, and it's amazing how much goes into that process, and we don't even think about it. You know what I mean? I guess we do think about it, but you know what I mean. We sort of take it for granted that it all works as well as it does sometimes, I think. So you can see here this cross section of a brain. The motor area is highlighted there, and then sensory area. It's really interesting also that these have been mapped as well on our in the cerebrum. But the central nervous system is your brain and your spinal cord, and then your peripheral nervous system is the efferent nerves, and other nerves, sensory nerves, any other nerves that are not part of your spinal cord and brain. So that core part. A motor homunculus is a drawing or a little figure there that emphasizes the, and I'm guessing it's the surface area, either the surface area or the volume on the figure or the statue, based on the number of the number of neurons and space in the brain dedicated to that part of the body. So in this case, if you I you know I find it easier to look at the little figure statue on the right. You can see that there are large portions of our brains in the motor cortex that are dedicated to hands. So humans are able to do pretty delicate, dexterous work with our fingers and hands. Uh, a lot more than most other animals. That's one of our, I think having big brains was an important part of us getting to where we are, but it's important to not overlook our hands and the ability that we have to manipulate stuff with our hands the way we do. Anyway, you can see the hands are huge, the wrists, the arms, the legs, the feet, not so much. The lips are pretty big as well. So we you can imagine that's really important for forming words and for facial expressions, where those are both really important to humans. And then a sensory homunculus looks at and emphasizes the portions of the brain dedicated to sensation. You can see it's not that different from the motor homunculus, maybe some small changes here and there. But again, the hands dominate, and so do the lips. The tongue is a little bigger, I think, in I don't know, maybe not. The tongue is fairly large in each of those. Um, again, for being able to speak, and maybe, well, I guess the tongue, maybe not so much for expressions, although we use the tongue for certain expressions still. Anyway, right, the process of muscle contraction, and this really is not the explanation you'll get today is not really adequate for understanding this process, but I'll give you a quick overview. There's basically a wave of electrical potential that moves along your neurons. So you have neurons that go from your brain to your spinal cord and spinal cord to your muscles. You decide that you want something to move. You're going to speak or you're going to walk. Um, so a signal initiates the movement somewhere in your brain, or if it's walking, a lot of those signals actually come straight from the spinal cord, saves time, and it is literally sort of like muscle memory. It's not in the muscle, but it's that information is stored in your spinal cord. But anyway, the signal starts somewhere, so I guess in your conscious brain, you would decide to walk, but the sort of program for walking is stored in your spinal cord. Anyway, that signal travels through a nerve, and it's a bit of a an electrical wave that moves down the the neuron, and the body creates that wave by artificially creating an imbalance, an electrical imbalance from outside of the neuron to the inside of the neuron. You can see in this first resting state image here, the resting potential there is negative 70 millivolts. And we've been able to measure that. But you can see there are all these, they're positive ions, or rather, there are several negative, excuse me, ions within the neuron, and then several sodium ions, and they're the purple positive ions outside the cell. And what happens is, so those, um, well, anyway, so there's for that wave to start, you can see the red. So in step one, depolarization, you can see that a wave is coming in from further up the neuron, and the potential is starting to change. The electrical difference between inside and outside is starting to change. Once it reaches a certain threshold, you can see in step two, those sodium channels, those purple channels open up, and the sodium ions rush into the neuron, and now we've not only equalized to where we're even, we're actually now, it's positive inside the cell compared to outside. So it's actually flipped completely at this point. If you go down to step three, so make sure you're not in step four, but looking at step three here, at that point, once you reach 30, a positive 30 millivolts, then the sodium channels are inactivated and the potassium channels get activated, and they open up, and potassium ions then flood out of the neuron. And I misspoke earlier about the those potassium ions being negative. They're positive. I apologize for that. Anyway, so the potassium ions flood out, and now we did a 180 all the way up to positive 30 millivolts, and now we're gonna go right back to where we were, but we overshoot a little bit here. Um, so what happens is there's a sodium potassium pump that that gets everything back to the way it was before. So it puts the potassium back in the neuron, and it takes pushes the sodium back out to get us back to that resting state. When that signal travels from your brain down to the muscle, it travels through the spinal cord. So this black and white, this grayscale figure that you see on the left is a cross section of, somewhere in your spine. Um, and you have efferent nerves and afferent nerves. So, and I need to make sure I get these right. I forget which one goes to which. So I'm going to try and pull that up while I continue. Um, so that signal travels. Okay. I just wanted to be sure here. Afferent is from sensory neurons, and it goes away from your extremities towards your core. So it'll be carrying information like hot, cold, touch, tension from your muscles, from your skin to your brain. And efferent nerves carry motor signals from your brain to your muscles. So it'll travel through an efferent nerve. You can see this motor axon in the right figure. So there are actually um, three nerves here traveling down to the muscle. There are three neurons, and those go from the spinal cord all the way to the muscle, wherever it happens to be, and they innervate a single muscle fiber. So a motor unit is that motor axon and the fiber that it innervates. Real briefly, some of the anatomy of the muscle. You can see we have the muscle, so there's a bit of a hierarchy here. The muscle itself, so it's think of your quads like the image here. Your quads, your quad muscle is made of many muscle fascicles. So it's grouped into these fascicles, and from that image, it looks like there's at least 20 or 30 fascicles there. Each fascicle is made of, and again, from the image, it looks like about 20 muscle fibers. Each fiber is made up of, and this one looks more like maybe 50 or so myofibrils. Okay. And finally, each fibril is made up of myofilaments. And if we look at the myofilaments, we can see something that's called the sarcomere. That's a functional unit within a myofilament. So we have actin and we have myosin, and let's go to the next picture to talk about what happens here. And the way this was explained to me is that think of these cross bridges. So the pink part, like the little, they look like little, I don't know, flippers or something. Um, so the myosin really, really, really wants to bind with the actin. It's like it's in love with it or something. Um, but it can't because there's tropomyosin and troponin in the way, so they block the binding sites. And basically, what happens is, well, um, I'm gonna jump back and forth a little bit. So what happens is that you can see ATP here, so that's our body's form of energy. Um, but calcium has to enter the muscle cell. It has to enter the muscle fiber, and the calcium binds onto the tropomyosin and the troponin that moves them away so that the myosin can bind. So it's all happy and it jumps on there. And you can see at the very, so I'm kind of going in order of the right figure. Um, so at the top, the troponin and tropomyosin is bound. It's not going anywhere. The calcium comes in the middle, and it moves the troponin tropomyosin away so that myosin can bind. It kind of extends itself out there and grabs on. And then you can see that it uses the chemical energy in ATP to contract, and it changes its shape basically, but it's like a tiny, tiny microscopic contraction. You can see that there are lots and lots of little myosin heads here, and think of it kind of like pulling a rope hand over hand. That is basically the process that goes on for your muscle contraction. So those heads will pull on the actin. The actin is the blue filament there, they'll pull it like a rope, and then they will release after the energy, after the ATP is used up and discarded. Then the myosin heads will let go, and then they'll reach again to pull once more. Anyway, so that's the basic process for how your muscles contract. Uh, this is a quick this is a quick summary of that entire process, and we've kind of touched on this already. The one thing that we haven't really talked about is the neurochemical part of this. So acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter. It's you know the neurons use electricity. They literally use electricity to send impulses, but there are certain points where we have to use a chemical marker, a chemical messenger to continue the message, and acetylcholine is one of those chemical messengers. Uh, so what happens is once the once the electrical signal reaches a synapse, so the end of the neuron, where it's at its final resting place, that may be right at the muscle, then it releases acetylcholine, and that is what continues to trigger the impulse in the muscle, and then after there's a space. So let's go here. So if you look at the left with the yellow neuron, um, it's trying to show that there's this wave moving down, an electrical impulse. It reaches the end of the synapse. You can see there's this space here between the muscle and the end of the neuron. So once the signal reaches there, the the synapse, the end of the neuron, releases the acetylcholine. It's the ACH with the little red minus sign and the green circle. So that gets released, and it binds on to the muscle to go ahead and tell it to contract. So you can see it crosses over, it opens. What actually happens is it helps to open sodium potassium channels, which creates an electrical impulse within the muscle, and that electrical impulse travels down to the sarcomere, where it releases the calcium that allows the myosin heads to bind, like we talked about. Anyway, so acetylcholinesterase, the ACHE, is an enzyme. Whenever you hear ACE, think of an enzyme, and the way my molecular biology professor described those is an enzyme is something that does kung fu on a protein. So it's going to break up a protein. Anyway, so the acetylcholinesterase is an enzyme that does kung fu on acetylcholine. So at a certain point, acetylcholinesterase will be released to break up all the acetylcholine. Once you tell your muscle, hey, stop, I don't need you to contract anymore, that's released, and it breaks it up, and the contraction stops. And all of this happens really quickly. It's amazing that it works as well as it does. Some drugs will target uh, parts of these processes. So acetylcholine blockers, well, I say drugs, also diseases. In this case, we're looking at diseases. Also, botulin is, I believe, it's found in honey, and it's one reason that you know kids under 1 year of age cannot eat honey because their immunity isn't good enough um, to be to fight it off. You also, Botox is a shot that people will get that I think uses this same acetylcholine blocker. I'm not totally sure on those, but then there's also curare, which blocks receptors on the so postsynaptic membrane means after the synapse, and that prevents your muscle from contracting. So the same thing with botulinum. Anything that blocks acetylcholine is going to stop muscles from contracting. So the Botox is an injection that is supposed to help with wrinkles and stuff. Anyway, and acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. These are two pretty hazardous pesticides. But you can imagine anything that does that is going to prevent the release of contraction. So it's going to continually stimulate your muscle to contract. So to continue where we left off from the synapse, after the acetylcholine tells your muscle to go ahead and contract, the impulse travels down. You can see in the upper left of the pink part here, the impulse is traveling down. Once it reaches the sarcomere, where you can see these tan colored they're these tan colored vesicles or chambers. They're called it's called the cistern of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. But anyway, once it reaches there, it tells the sarcomere to release calcium, and you can see the calcium jumps in where the blue rope, the actin is, and the myosin is. That's the pink part, and uh, and so you know that the troponin and tropomyosin is getting moved out of the way so that myosin can grab on to the actin rope and pull on it and make contraction. After the ATP gets used up, then you got to get more ATP to continue the process. So that's how you burn energy through muscle contraction. There are two types of work, dynamic and static, and we've already talked about some of these in class. We have talked about them. And dynamic is a type of work we're made to do. We're designed to do it. We're not designed for static work. That's what machines are for. Um, so blood supply is an important part of that contrast between the two types of work. You have, for example, if you're resting, you don't need a lot of blood and you don't have a lot of blood flow. If you're doing dynamic work, then there's a lot of blood needed and there's a lot of blood flow. So hopefully you're getting, I mean, you should be getting the blood you need, or you're getting close to the blood that you need if you're doing dynamic work. However, if you're doing static work, you still need high blood, a large amount of blood, but the blood flow is low because your your muscles are helping. When it's dynamic, your muscles are helping to move that blood along and continue the flow. When you're static, um, the blood doesn't flow, not nearly as well. These are some examples of static work. We've talked about some of them already, and some other issues in more detail of static work. So it constricts blood flow, and the more force that's being exerted, the more blood flow that is being constricted, unfortunately. So it uses a higher amount of energy, it'll raise your heart rate, and you need longer and probably more frequent rest periods if you're doing static work. And that leads to static work, or anaerobic work will lead to muscle soreness. And the reason is that the muscle is not getting the oxygen it needs. So lactic acid builds up, and which is part of the waste that needs to be cleared out. But also your muscles get unhappy when they don't have enough oxygen. There are other types of wastes that build up in that process. And then finally, the cardiovascular system, which helps deliver those nutrients and food to our cells and our muscles and take away the waste. CO2 is another one of those wastes. And this looks kind of maybe a little bit confusing. So let's start with, and I wish I could draw a heart for you. So the the top part of this figure that's pointing out an atrium and ventricle is the left side of the heart. And the bottom part of this figure that's talking about atrium and ventricle is the right side of the heart. So you can imagine those two halves put together. But but each half supplies blood to different things. And let's start with the right heart. So the right heart, if you ever have a chance to look at a human heart, it is smaller. You'll notice that it's smaller and less muscular. And the reason is because all it has to do is send that blood to the lungs, which are pretty close. They're, the next door neighbor. It doesn't have to go very far. So the right ventricle, I'm looking down here at the bottom of the figure, the right ventricle doesn't have to pump real hard to get that blood to the lungs. So you have incoming blood from the body that collects in the right atrium. When the ventricle is ready, then the valve there opens up, the blood falls down into the ventricle. It's a one-way valve, so it closes and the right ventricle squeezes. The blood travels to the lungs, and here um, you can see oxygen coming in to the blood and CO2 leaving the blood. So the blood goes into the alveoli of your lungs. They look kind of like grape clusters, but that's where the gas exchange and what is officially called respiration. That's where respiration happens. The CO2 gets out of the blood and the oxygen gets in, and moving on up. So you can see it's pulmonary, capillary, and the alveolus is where we're at. Moving up from there, so as it leaves the lungs, it comes back to the heart, but now where it's on the left side, it enters the left atrium and collects there. As soon as the left ventricle is open, and I didn't say hey Siri. My phone thinks I did. As soon as the uh, ventricle is ready, that valve opens up, the blood goes into the left ventricle, and the left ventricle has to pump blood to your whole body. So it's quite a bit bigger, quite a bit more muscular than the right side of the heart, than the right ventricle. It squeezes and it's a pump, obviously. It's like a pump. So it squeezes nice and hard and it moves uh, all that blood through your aorta. Um, and the those arteries, your arteries generally have some muscle in them. Actually, it's a smooth type of muscle, and the arteries themselves will constrict to help move the blood along sometimes. Well, not sometimes, all the time. But anyway, so the blood leaves the left ventricle and then it reaches your muscles and wherever else it's going to go. There's a lot more involved in the process, but we're focused on the muscle part here. So finally, we get blood to our muscles that has nice, rich oxygen in it, and our muscles, eat that up basically, and then they dump their CO2, uh, and then the whole cycle repeats. So it's at the alveoli where the real action happens in terms of blood. That's where the you know our blood gets the clean oxygen and gets rid of all the CO2. If you think of your arteries and veins, or um, or also the airways in your lungs, it's all dead space. It's like the halls in your house. It's the halls in a home are not a living space. It's just for transportation. That's it. uh, the action, like the living, happens in all the rooms. And with your body, your blood vessels and your airways, they're like the hallways. They're just for transportation, but the action doesn't really happen there. The action happens in the muscle. The action happens in the alveoli, in the heart, um, and if you know the ventilation will depend on how deeply you're breathing, how quickly you're breathing, etc. This is just another depiction of the same idea with some numbers here. You can see that if you look at the venous blood on the far left, not all of the oxygen has been removed from the blood. There's still some oxygen in the blood. It's just there's a little bit more CO2, so the P is the partial I believe it is referring to partial pressure of the gas. But anyway, so there's a little bit more CO2 than oxygen when it reaches the pulmonary capillary. So this is the circle on the left. Then you can see there's quite a bit more oxygen than CO2. So a little bit of CO2 is left, and a lot of oxygen comes in. Once it moves into the arteries, then you can see it stays that way until it reaches the muscles. One thing to keep in mind is hemoglobin. It's a red blood cell, and it transports blood. Excuse me. It's what transports oxygen in the blood. So oxygen will bind to the hemoglobin. Once it does that, it makes it turn red. So that's why your arterial blood is red and your venous blood is blue. Um, so we talked a little bit about this. The heart is two pumps. The left is much bigger, and it goes to everything, this whole system. That's what it's called, systemic circuit there. The right just goes to the lungs. So that's why it's called the pulmonary circuit. The cardiac muscles work together. They're similar to skeletal muscle, so they're similar to the muscles that we typically think of. Your bicep, your quads. Um, Although we can't control them. That's one thing that's different between them. So they're autorhythmic. They take care of themselves. You use an ECG. It used to be called EKG, an ECG, to measure that the electrical impulses. And a brief overview. So there's a sinoatrial node. That's where that's sort of like the brain. That's where the signal starts. That impulse spreads down those internodal pathways. I'm looking at the figure on the right to the atrioventricular node, or AV node. From there, it travels down the AV bundle, and the bundle branches and then spreads. There's Purkinje fibers there, but it spreads to the rest of the heart. And as that does that, then the ventricle contracts. And you can see how you might want, say, the bottom of the ventricle to contract before the top. So I haven't seen this, but it would be a sort of a rolling contraction that helps move the blood up and out. When you look at an ECG, this is the type of wave you see. If you ever watch, movies with hospitals, um, this is something that you're familiar with. But each of those waves or pieces of this cycle have a name, and they refer to different things. So the P wave is the depolarization of the atria. So remember the there are two atriums, the right and the left. They're at the top of the heart, and that's really just the little chamber that holds the blood until the ventricles are ready. So the P wave, it's kind of little because the atria are both little. They don't have to be able to contract very hard because they're just pushing the blood into into next door, the ventricles, and actually mostly downstairs usually. Um, so they don't have to be very big. There's not a big event there. But then we have this QRS complex, and that is the depolarization of the ventricle. So those are the hard working parts. The right, yes, but especially the left ventricle, they got to generate a lot of force to pump the blood where it needs to go. And so you can see that whole complex QRS is that process, the depolarization for that. And then T is the repolarization of the ventricles, so getting them back to where they're supposed to be electrically. And finally, blood flow during exercise. If you've ever ate a big meal and then, or eaten a big meal and then try to go do exercise, then you experience the tug of war that happens within your body. So basically, what's happening is your guts are saying, "Hey, we need blood to come take care of this, to digest the food and pick up the nutrients." And so your guts are saying, "Hey, send more blood, send more blood." If if circumstances are ideal, you can lay down and have a little siesta. You'll rest and digest, uh, sort of a thing, and all is well. However, if you've made the mistake of eating and then don't go swimming. You might get cramps and you might drown. It's never a good idea to eat a big meal before you go swimming. But if you eat a big meal and you try to go do exercise, you're gonna have cramps. And it depends on who wins the tug of war, where you're gonna have the cramps. If your gut wins, then you may have muscle cramps. But at least for me, I don't think I've ever really experienced it. I think for me, mostly the muscles win, and so I get a stomach cramp. Um, and that's just your stomach saying, "Hey, wow, we've got all this stuff, and you're not sending blood to unload it, and we're not happy." Um, anyway, so you can see though how 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 much the amount of blood shifts and increases as you start doing exercise. It's many times greater. So if you're doing heavy exercise, your muscles are getting 10 times the blood that they typically get at rest. If you're doing maximal there, that's almost 20 times the amount of blood that they would be getting at rest. So they're pretty selfish when it comes to blood. All right, thanks, guys, and I will see you next week. Have a great weekend.